The year was 250 CE, and in the markets of Rome, something impossible was happening that would destroy the greatest empire in human history. A single coin that could have bought a modest house just 10 years earlier was now worthless, literally thrown into gutters because it wasn't worth the effort to pick up. What you're about to hear is the true story of the first economic collapse in recorded history, when the Roman Empire experienced hyperinflation so devastating that it made modern financial crises look like minor accounting errors. This wasn't just about rising prices or economic hardship. This was about the complete breakdown of the concept of money itself. Roman coins that had been trusted for centuries suddenly became worthless overnight, creating chaos so total that it would contribute to the fall of Western civilization. And the most shocking part, it all started with a single emperor's desperate attempt to pay his soldiers. Picture the Roman Empire at its height, stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf, the most powerful economic system the world had ever known. Roman coins were accepted from Scotland to Sudan, more trusted than any currency before it or since. The silver denarius was the dollar of the ancient world, so reliable that foreign kings preferred Roman money to their own. But all of that was about to change forever. The crisis began with Emperor Septimius Severus and his deathbed advice to his sons. Keep the soldiers happy, ignore everyone else. This simple statement would unleash an economic disaster that destroyed 3 centuries of financial stability, because keeping the soldiers happy meant paying them. And the Roman treasury was already empty from decades of warfare and massive public spending. Severus's son Caracalla took his father's advice literally. He doubled military wages overnight, creating the largest government expense in Roman history. But there was a problem. The empire didn't have enough silver to mint the coins needed to pay this enormous salary increase. So Caracalla made a decision that seemed logical at the time, but would destroy the Roman economy. He ordered the debasement of Roman currency. Debasement sounds technical and boring, but what it meant was simple and catastrophic. Roman mints began mixing cheap metals like copper and tin with the precious silver that gave coins their value. A denarius that had once been 98% pure silver was gradually reduced to 90%, then 80%, then 50%. The coins looked the same, bore the same imperial stamps, but contained a fraction of their supposed value. At first, the debasement was subtle enough that ordinary Romans didn't notice. The coins still shined, still felt substantial, still bought the same amount of bread and wine. But merchants and money changers began testing the coins with acid, discovering that the silver content was declining. They started charging slightly higher prices to compensate for their reduced metal value, triggering the first phase of Roman inflation. Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217 CE, but his successors continued the debasement policy because they faced the same impossible mathematics: military expenses that exceeded imperial income. Every new emperor promised to restore the currency, but every one of them ended up reducing silver content even further to pay for immediate needs. The Roman economy was caught in a death spiral disguised as monetary policy. By 240 CE, under Emperor Gordian III, the situation had become desperate. Roman coins contained less than 20% silver, but the government continued pretending they were worth full value. Merchants began refusing to accept imperial currency, preferring to barter goods directly rather than accept coins that might be worth half their face value within months. The money system that had unified the Mediterranean was collapsing. The psychological impact was as devastating as the economic consequences. For 3 centuries, Romans had believed their currency was backed by the power and permanence of their empire. Silver denarii represented not just purchasing power, but imperial authority itself. When the coins became worthless, it suggested that Roman power itself was an illusion, that the greatest empire in history was built on lies. The hyperinflation accelerated under the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire faced simultaneous barbarian invasions, civil wars, and plague. Desperate emperors minted coins with almost no silver content, essentially creating official counterfeits of their own currency. A denarius from 260 CE contained less than 5% silver, making it worth roughly 1/20th of a coin from just 50 years earlier. The human cost was staggering. Ordinary Romans who had saved money for retirement found their life savings worthless overnight. A farmer who had stored coins worth a year's income discovered they wouldn't buy a week's food. Veterans who had served the empire faithfully for decades received pensions in currency that became worthless before they could spend it. The Roman middle class was essentially wiped out by imperial monetary policy. But the most shocking aspect of Roman hyperinflation was how it created a parallel economy based entirely on real goods. Merchants stopped accepting coins altogether, instead trading wheat for wine, cloth for pottery, services for livestock. The sophisticated monetary system that had enabled Mediterranean commerce for centuries was replaced by primitive barter that severely limited economic activity. Regional commanders began minting their own coins, using whatever silver they could acquire through taxation or conquest. Gaul had different currency than Britain. Spain used different money than Greece. The unified Roman economy fractured into dozens of separate systems, each with its own exchange rates and acceptance standards. The empire was literally falling apart one coin at a time. The government's response to the crisis made everything worse. Instead of admitting the debasement and attempting reform, imperial authorities doubled down on the fiction that their worthless coins retained full value. They passed laws requiring merchants to accept imperial currency at face value, with death penalties for refusing government money. But laws couldn't create silver that didn't exist. Black markets flourished as people desperately sought alternatives to worthless imperial currency. Foreign coins from Persia and India commanded enormous premiums. Gold became so valuable that even tiny amounts were hoarded like treasures. Some Romans melted down household items to create improvised currency, turning spoons and jewelry into unofficial money that retained actual metal value. The military implications were catastrophic. Roman legions had been the most effective fighting force in history, partly because soldiers were well paid and equipped. But when their wages became worthless, discipline collapsed. Legions began looting Roman cities to obtain real wealth. The army that was supposed to protect the empire became one of its greatest threats. Barbarian tribes exploited the monetary chaos brilliantly. They demanded payment in gold or goods rather than worthless Roman coins. When Romans couldn't pay, the barbarians simply took what they wanted. The financial weakness created military vulnerability that enemies were quick to exploit. Inflation had literally bankrupted the empire's defense capabilities. The social consequences were equally devastating. Roman society had been held together by complex economic relationships, landlords collecting rent, merchants extending credit, craftsmen receiving payment for goods. When currency became unreliable, these relationships broke down. People retreated into self-sufficient communities, abandoning the specialization and trade that had made Roman civilization possible. Diocletian finally attempted serious monetary reform around 294 CE, introducing new gold coins with guaranteed precious metal content. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Centuries of debased currency had destroyed public confidence in imperial money. Even legitimate coins were viewed with suspicion. The psychological trauma of hyperinflation had permanently damaged the Roman monetary system. The edict on maximum prices was Diocletian's desperate attempt to control inflation through government decree. He set maximum prices for over 1,000 different goods and services, with death penalties for charging more than the official rates. But price controls couldn't create the silver that gave money its value. They just drove commerce underground and made shortages worse. The religious implications were profound and disturbing. Many once Romans interpreted the monetary collapse as evidence that the gods had abandoned the empire. Traditional Roman religion had emphasized the divine nature of imperial authority, but worthless coins suggested that emperors had lost heavenly favor. This spiritual crisis contributed to the rapid spread of Christianity, which offered hope beyond earthly institutions. Regional differences in how communities handled the monetary crisis reveal the empire's fundamental disunity. Urban areas with sophisticated commercial networks suffered most from hyperinflation, while rural communities that had always relied partly on barter adapted more easily. The crisis essentially reversed centuries of economic development, forcing people back to pre-monetary exchange systems. Archaeological evidence shows how completely Roman currency collapsed. Coin hoards from the period contain mostly issues from before 240 CE. After that date, people simply stopped saving Roman money because they knew it would become worthless. Modern excavations ought to rarely find coins from the hyperinflation period, not because they weren't minted, but because no one bothered to keep them. The technological impact was equally significant. Roman engineering and construction projects ground to a halt because workers couldn't be paid in reliable currency. The aqueducts, roads, and public buildings that had defined Roman civilization stopped being maintained. Infrastructure decay accelerated as the empire lost the financial tools needed to fund public works. International trade relationships were destroyed. Mediterranean commerce had depended on Roman currency as a common medium of exchange. When denarii became worthless, merchants reverted to primitive barter systems that severely limited the scope and efficiency of trade. The economic integration that had created prosperity across the empire unraveled completely. Modern economists studying Roman hyperinflation have identified patterns that appear in every subsequent monetary collapse. The gradual loss of precious metal content, government denial of the problem, legal attempts to force acceptance of worthless currency, and the ultimate retreat to barter and alternative money systems. The Roman crisis established a template that would be repeated throughout history. The psychological lessons are equally important. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy wealth, it destroys faith in institutions. When governments debase their currency, they're essentially stealing from everyone who holds their money. The betrayal of trust involved in monetary debasement can permanently damage the relationship between rulers and citizens. Constantine's eventual monetary reform in 312 CE introduced the gold solidus, which restored some stability to Roman currency. But the new system was based on gold rather than silver, making it accessible only to the wealthy. The common people who had been devastated by hyperinflation were essentially excluded from the reformed monetary system, creating permanent economic inequality. The Western Roman Empire never fully recovered from the monetary crisis of the 3rd century. While the Eastern Empire survived by adopting more conservative fiscal policies, the West continued struggling with currency problems until its final collapse in 476 CE. Hyperinflation had fatally weakened the institutional foundations that had sustained Roman power for centuries. The connection between monetary policy and imperial survival couldn't be clearer. When Rome debased its currency to fund immediate needs, it destroyed the long-term financial stability that had made its power possible. The short-term solution of printing worthless money created the long-term problem of economic collapse. The empire essentially committed financial suicide to pay its bills. Modern parallels to Roman hyperinflation are terrifying. Every government that has attempted to solve fiscal problems by devaluing its currency has eventually faced similar consequences. The temptation to create money without creating value is universal, but so are the catastrophic results when that artificial money floods the economy. The Roman experience demonstrates that monetary trust, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild, even after successful reforms. Roman currency never regained the universal acceptance it had enjoyed before the crisis. The psychological damage from hyperinflation lasted longer than the empire itself, influencing European monetary policy for centuries. The next time someone suggests that governments can solve their problems by printing more money, remember the Roman coins that went from buying mansions to being thrown away as worthless metal, because the laws of economics are as unchanging as the laws of physics, and attempts to violate them always end in disaster. If stories about how economic collapse has shaped the rise and fall of civilizations fascinate you, subscribe to The Gray Hour for more explorations of the financial forces that have determined the fate of empires, because understanding monetary history is essential for recognizing when modern governments are making the same fatal mistakes.